this is Steel Zenith, and today I'm going to be performing a little docking tutorial in 0.23. I've set up this fuel tanker just to orbit Kerbin at a rather eccentric orbit. And the first thing I've done is point it roughly at 90 degrees to my orbit, which should ensure that it stays relatively pointing the same direction while it orbits Kerbin. So the next thing I'm going to do is get a craft up here to intercept, and I'll show you that in a second. So I'm just building the craft that I'm going to intercept and dock with the tanker with. And one thing to make sure when you're building a craft that's going to dock with other craft is you want to get your RCS distributed equally around the center of mass point. So you can see I've put them low down and high up on this craft. Probably could put them a bit higher. So essentially this should ensure that when I translate, it's not going to be firing unequally from, or rather that it won't fire one and send it into a spin. So the other thing I need to still add to this is SAS and a small engine just to do other maneuvers. See you on the launch pad. So here we are on the launch pad, and just don't want to just launch. I want to wait until the path of this tanker goes roughly over my launch site. So just gonna wait until that happens. And as luck would have it, it's passing over just now. Yeah, we're not gonna catch up with it while we launch, because it's already passing overhead, and it's going to take us a while to get up to speed. However, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set it as a target, and I can see that it's travelling along this vector here, north-south, northwest, rather. Is that northwest? Northeast. So essentially I'm going to try and launch so that I end up in roughly the same orbital path. So I'll just carry on doing this launch and get into orbit and see you once we're there. So as you can see, I'm now on a suborbital trajectory, roughly in line with the path of the tanker. Our apoapsis is roughly the same height as the tanker's apoapsis, but my eventual periaps will be lower because I want to catch up with it. If you want to catch up with something that's orbiting the same body as you are, the way to do it is to go into a lower orbit. Conversely, if you want it to catch up with you, you go into a higher orbit. Obviously, if I took a higher orbit, eventually this would go all the way round and catch up with me, but that would take far longer than me going into a lower orbit and then catching up from there. So that's something to bear in mind when you're building a station. You want to leave yourself a bit of room to get into lower orbit or a higher orbit. Obviously, if the body that you're orbiting does not have atmosphere, that's not really a problem. But in this case, our periaps needs to be above 60-odd thousand meters, and 70,000 should do fine. So we can see this will just take a small burn to get us into this orbit, and we'll perform that, and I'll see when I've done that. So as you can see, I've performed that burn, and my periapsis is now, I'm just going to raise it above the 60,000 mark so it can accelerate. My Periaps is now at 70,000, so we should be catching up with the tanker as we orbit the planet. Yeah. The reason why it was going up there is because we're slightly out of line with it in terms of the angle. So in order to do that, we're going to do a slight plane change maneuver just to get perfectly on the same angle as the tanker, and that will be when the descending and ascending node are at 0. So I'll just do that, and then we'll let it accelerate time a bit to catch up with it. You don't want to be doing too much of a different orbit to your target, because you can end up overshooting it by quite a bit. But basically, if we just let it orbit a few times, we should catch up with it, and then we can perform the maneuver in order to get close into it once we're at a good distance from it, which I'd recommend to be about below about 5 kilometers. Anything higher and it's a bit inefficient, so just going to accelerate here, and as you can see, we're closing the distance with the tanker, and every time we pass the intersect point, it'll give us a new one for the next orbit. So as you can see now, our intersect is going to be quite close to it. So what I want to do is I want to bring my periaps a bit higher, because I know that next orbit I will pass it if I don't. So essentially that's our periaps slightly raised, and I'll wait until I'm roughly here again to perform the next burn. So just speeding on round, slowly catching up with this thing. I think one of the major lessons to learn in doing docking maneuvers is that you really don't want to rush things. Just take it easy and make small adjustments. So now you can see, if I carried on this trajectory, I would end up being ahead of it. So basically what I want to do is find my, not that vector. You need to sometimes switch back to orbital things, because when you get close to it, it'll start, it'll change to being the target's vectors, or rather your vector in relation to the target. So now that I've got it down to about 6.8, I'm going to switch to RCS, and you can use H and B to accelerate or decelerate with RCS. I'm just raising my periapsis by tiny amounts to get this spot on, or as close as I feel happy with. So that's about as good as you can ask. 0.5, 0.4 per kilometer. Intersect is very close in orbital terms. So So you can see periaps are still slightly slower, so when we get to this point I will have to raise it slightly just to match up speeds with the target. However, at that point I'll be using my vectors and speed relative to the target rather than using my vectors and speed relative to the planet or to my orbit around the planet, because it makes it much easier to do the fine adjustments. So we're just going to time accelerate until we're at that point, or close to that point rather. So just going to slow down a bit there. If we go to map mode, you'll see that we can actually see the tanker. So basically, now that I've switched to this mode, I can see my vectors relative to the tanker. And what I can do now is just kill my velocity relative to it. So that's us down to roughly going at the same speed as the tanker. Now what I want to do is find on the nav ball the pink dot that looks like that, because that's my that's the position of my target relative to me, and just accelerate towards it at fairly slow speed. I mean, when we're down to about 500 meters, you don't really want to be doing too fast speed, because you do need to kill all your velocity when you get to it. I mean, it's unlikely that we're actually going to hit it, but we could go speeding past it if we speed too hard. If you're further out, you want to accelerate a bit harder, because we're both traveling in different orbits. Our positions relative to each other will change quite fast, so you don't want to take too long about this. But you'll notice that my vector is drifting slightly to the left compared to him, and what I can do is I can engage SAS and just use the SAS translation, which is IJKL, to move the marker back to over the target. So that's it, pointing again almost bang on the target, and at this point I'm actually going to slow down slightly. So that's the N key to slow down using SAS. Just slow down to about 3 meters a second. So you can we can see it on our quite clearly on our screen now. And I want to dock with that end of the tanker. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to change my vector slightly so that I'm not going to go straight towards it anymore, and I'm just going to go past it and then turn round and perform the docking from there. So basically now I can turn and I want to kill most of my velocity relative to the tanker. And the other thing I want to do is I want to eject this part, because we're balanced around the rest. This is balance, we know that. So if I now point towards my target, I engage a tiny bit of the main engine. And you could do this with RCS, it's not really necessary to use the main engine for this. So the easiest thing to do now is to switch to the chase cam, which will orientate ourselves so that when I fire my RCS, I know which ones to use. For example, I was just using the I key, which you can see is thrusting us downwards. And likewise, the K key will negate that thrust. So I just want to pass slightly south of the, or slightly below the docking port. And then basically just kill my velocity relative to it. So now I can see where it's pointing roughly. The easiest thing to do is to find that pink marker again on the nav ball. And I'm not perfectly aligned with it, but with these smaller craft it doesn't really matter if you're perfectly aligned. With a larger one you want to be slightly better, have a slightly better alignment with it. But if you see, I want to get that, oops, I want to be using RCS. I want to get that, all the markers lined up, and I know that that means that I'm pointing straight at my target and my vector is straight at my target. And now as we drift in, the magnetic should engage and I can just turn off SAS, and there we are, docked. So hopefully this was helpful to you. And once you've mastered docking, you pretty much can do some really insane missions. It's one of those skills that really helps in KSP. And I think the most important thing to remember is just don't perform any massive changes in velocity. Always change it gradually so that you can always correct what you've done wrong. As you see, that only took about 20 monopropellant there to do that. However, if you're using a larger craft, obviously you want more. And remember to balance your docking port, your RCS thrusters around your center of gravity, because that'll help you a lot when you're actually doing the docking. So yeah, another thing I'd recommend is putting lights on. This isn't actually necessary, but if you're doing a docking in the dark, then having lights can really help you. So yeah, hopefully this was helpful to you guys, and once again, I'm still Zenith, and thanks for watching. Goodbye.